All right. Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and to be with you. My name is Dan Winter. This conversation is about the science of sacred geometry and how to apply it practically in your everyday life. Many of you know about our work in sacred geometry, fractalfield.com, goldenmean.info, therify.net. Today's conversation is particularly about understanding how a scientist would view sacred geometry and what sacred geometry does in terms of the power of science to understand deeply the meaning. And further, we want to see some very practical applications of sacred geometry in terms of the hygiene for healing, successful death, the hygiene for bliss. So the practice of spiritual work in your life can be served by a scientific understanding of sacred geometry. Now, if you're a scientist, a lot of times if you hear people, maybe they're kind of new age and they think they're spiritual, and they talk about sacred geometry, and scientists really tend to not take that very seriously. But actually, there's profound, important, deep science under the concept of sacred geometry, and that's what we want to find here. Now, specifically, when we say geometry, it is well known in science and physics that waves are born because they make geometry. So when waves cross and interfere, like this picture here, the reason the waves cross and interfere constructively is because the wavelength divides evenly into the circumference of rotation. I mean, that's essentially the name for quantum mechanics. And so when the wavelength, for example, a pent or a hex, divides evenly into the circumference of charge rotation, that essentially is what allows the wave to become a standing wave and form stable wave nodes. And those wave nodes of charge, in science, we call that mass. That is how mass is created out of light, out of charge, because when the wave stands, the compression point creates the illusion of stability out of what is essentially continuous motion. So everyone in physics is clear, there is no subject in physics which is not geometry. Geometry is how waves form matter. So you must study geometry. That's what all of physics is about. So then what does the word sacred mean to a scientist? Now that may get a little more interesting. You know that when Korotkov went to measure sacred space for the Kogis, the place where the Kogi tribes effectively made phone calls to ancestors. Let's see, that's slide number 218. See, we have that slide. So Professor Korotkov is very famous, and he went to see where these sacred tribes of South America, like you in Brazil, where they went to phone their ancestors. And he measured what we call the fractality of the air. So essentially, if you put a conductor, this is a picture of the end of a titanium rod, and on the left you see the titanium rod. When you put charge on the rod, the charge goes only a little way away from the titanium rod. This is exactly the same tool you use for measuring your aura, called GDV, gas discharge visualization, except in this case we're measuring air. We call it the fractality in air, but more correctly, it is a measure of charge distribution efficiency. Charge distribution efficiency. And you see then here on the right, this is the same titanium rod in sacred space, a place where the Kogis can make phone calls to ancestors. And sure enough, the charge, the same kind of high voltage is applied. And if you make a picture of the charge radiance, the same way you would make a picture of your aura with a fingertip Kirlian GDV, but in this case, we're measuring air. And sure enough, the charge propagates very efficiently in sacred space. So now Korotkov called that fractality in air. It's specifically an indication of how efficiently that spark is able to propagate. Well, when you really think about it, and you think, later in this conversation when we talk about how you die successfully, why do you need sacred space to phone ancestors and a sacred space in which to die or even be born or to have bliss successfully, it's because you need charge distribution efficiency. So that ability of the air to distribute charge perfectly predicted the place where you could phone ancestors, because sacred, in the term sacred space, is defined by the ability of that spark, that charge, to unpack efficiently. And actually, in English, our word heaven, I don't know if this works in Brazil, but in English, when you say heaven, hey ave, hey is breath of charge, ave is to take flight, or plains of Sharon is actually a perfectly unpacked charge, which is the name for heaven in Hebrew, or the Champs-Élysées en français is the charge, the avenue on which charge can propagate efficiently. So charge distribution efficiency is about the definition of sacred, and it is about how you create life force. So here's this slide we're looking at, that when you have sacred space, you can measure that plants and children grow very well. Why? Because their aura can unpack efficiently. Now, the name for that geometry in which charge can unpack efficiency is called fractality. It means the little inside looks like the big outside. It's the same geometry, just scale change. And that ability to achieve compression perfectly in science is called fractality, where the inside looks like the outside. And it's quite famous that in Africa, famously, this is a picture famous from Dr. Ron Eglash, who showed that ancient African village construction was very, very fractal. So the altar in the shaman's thatched hut, little house, looked like the house, and the straw house that the shaman looked at was the same shape as the village, and the village was the same shape as, and that was the same shape as. So when the inside looks like the outside, that self-similarity or embed-ability is called fractality in science. And you see, in this little model we have here, you see where if the inside, in this case it's a torus, which is golden ratio 0.618, the size of the outside. So if the little donut is in the right ratio, it can non-destructively embed and live inside the bigger donut. So that's called embeddability. Embeddability means the little thing can pack non-destructively inside the bigger thing, and both of them can spin with their charge, and the little thing can be inside the big thing, and neither of them is hurt. In other words, both of them constructively interfere. Now that physics of how the little wave can exist inside the big wave is literally, I mean, how you can thrive inside the mind of what you call God, which actually is the name for a much larger torus field of charge. In fact, in physics, our word for the field effect of charge, which is always toroidal or donut shaped, our word in physics for that is domain, the domain of the charge. And guess what our word for God is? Dominus vobiscum. Why is our word for God, domain, the same as the word for a field of charge? Let's think about that for a moment. So this idea that sacred space is a place, yes, and here this is another picture of the same thing. The sacred tree compared to a dead metal barn is a place where charge can unpack and distribute. And then in that sacred space, if you measure the harmonic content, called harmonic inclusiveness, you measure the weak electric field of a tree, for example, and here we're seeing the blue lines are actually the Schumann harmonics, and the white lines are the measured frequency in this very happy tree. So that harmonic inclusiveness, also called fractality, ability to include a maximum number of harmonics which are non-destructively compressed, defines sacred space. So what we're saying here is that the sacred in sacred geometry is the name for a place wherein which charge distribution, wherein waves are distributed very efficiently because they're compressible, and perfected compressibility in physics is called fractal, as in our website, a fractalfield.com. So there's another important meaning to the term sacred in sacred geometry, and that is because in a sacred space, the little wave can survive without destructive interference inside the bigger wave. The term sacred also means the presence of longer waves. Now that's, at first that seems quite simple, but when you really think about it, in ancient villages and Aboriginal villages, the concept of spirituality, in fact, the concept of having soul, how does a scientist say what is a soul? Well, Aboriginals, ancient tribes, I'm sure the tribes in Brazil also had a very specific idea of what a soul is. And a good indicator of having a soul is the presence of long memory, which is the presence of long waves, which is the presence of embeddability. So when you talk about the Great Spirit or God, if you're a scientist, it is implied quite clearly and usefully scientifically that the large presence that we call the divine is quite literally the presence of order in a much larger electric field. Now, if a much larger electric field has order, that means it's centripetal, that means it implodes and the charge moves towards center, not away from center. Centripetal is the opposite of centrifugal, exactly in the way that implosion is the opposite of explosion. And everything we talk about today is focused on how you create implosion and centripetal force, because that's how you create what's called negentropy, or self-organization, or mindfulness at the center of an imploding waveform. Think of, is a tornado conscious if there's an eyeball at the center? Does that make it mindful? So the presence of mindfulness is the self-organization that exists because a field effect is implosive, which means, I have another toy here to play with now, which means there's something creating suction at the center of the donut. Now in physics, everything is made of donuts. There's nothing else. It's called toroidal charge fields. Everything in physics is a donut-shaped charge field. There's nothing else in physics. And the vortex into and out of those donuts is called string theory or wormholes in physics. But for example, when you ask a child who's learning to see without their eyes by learning a trance, a bliss, you can read about that at flameinmind.com. We teach kids to see without their eyes, which is well known. They're blindfolded and they're seeing without their eyes. And they go into this relaxed trance or bliss, and their brain waves become harmonic inclusive, which is fractal. They have a golden ratio cascade, alpha, beta, theta, in their brain waves. And then the child says, I see a vortex tunnel opening inside my head. And when I look through the tunnel, I can see through there like it's an eyeball at the center of the tunnel, even when they're blindfolded. Now that is proof that a charge or plasma vortex is not just the physics of vision, but it's the physics of consciousness in general. Consciousness is that plasma charge vortex coming to focus and making an eyeball. We know that because if you ask the medical doctors who had near-death experiences and they saw from outside their body, watching surgery happening on their body during near-death experience, the place from which they saw outside their body is a plasma vortex. In the same way, that is a predictor for how remote viewing and lucid dreaming work. You take a plasma vortex with you, and when we get there in this conversation, we want to talk about how we can make an electric field using sacred geometry that creates lucid dreaming. Ability to see coherently from outside your body, remote viewing, lucid dreaming. I'm an electrical engineer. How does an electrical engineer talk about what you take outside your body when you lucid dream and when you die? I'm here to tell you that I designed an electric field named Therify.net. I'm going to show you pictures that triggers lucid dreaming. And we know lucid dreaming is probably the best predictor of whether you will take memory with you when you die. And sacred geometry is the way we learn how to make the electric field which enables successful death. And that will be the climax of this conversation. But actually, we wanted to do a little bit more gentle introduction before we got to the cosmic stuff. So let's just see if we understood our basic introduction to sacred geometry. Let's use some very basic conversation now. So at least we've defined the sacred as in sacred geometry. The sacred is what enables charge to implode and then radiate and be distributed efficiently or fractally. Like if you look at the top-down view of Prague, the magnetic map of that city looks like a rose, and it attracts tourists and money because it's a fractal attractor. Well, the reason for that is sacred geometry, that in that rose petal or fractal pattern, the magnetic map of that place is called sacred because of the short waves and the long waves all agree there. They implode there. The way we say that in practical terms is that if you would like to create sacred space, first you need basic dowsing skills to be able to feel magnetic lines. It's very important. And the more you have access to bliss, the more your blood will boil, your hair will stand up. And then when you walk across a sacred magnetic line on Earth, and you relax and you hold your hands out, your hair will stand up. It's called dowsing or geobiology. So you do need to be able to feel a magnetic line. That is, to my view, that is a survival-related skill. And the more you practice and have access to bliss, the more your blood will be implosive. It's called fusion in the blood. The article about that is goldenmean.info/geobiology and goldenmean.info/dowsing. So we have pictures of the dowsing skill. So once you can feel a magnetic line, then you want to create sacred space, make a magnetic map of your bed, your house, your garden, your village. And in each case, your job is to rearrange the magnetic lines with like sacred stones and high dielectric organic materials. So you rearrange the charge lines so that they all look like a rose. Your bed, your house, your garden, and your village. When all those magnetic lines look like a rose, then you're done. You see that? Because that creates sacred space, because that creates fractality. So in this picture, we see that if you arrange those magnetic lines to look like a pent inside a pent, which also is 10 spirals of golden mean, as you can see in the picture on the far right, that this is the opposite of a hex. So if you rearrange those magnetic lines to look like a hexagram, which is like an ice crystal, you create stasis and you create charge isolation, which is very good for creating stability, but very bad for creating implosion. So the difference between the hex and the pent, it isn't that one is good or one is evil, but they're used in nature for very different things. A hexagram, the radius equals the edge length, so it's perfect to stabilize charge, but there will be no implosion. Therefore, there will be charge stability, there will be charge isolation. Nature uses hexagrams to stabilize and isolate. Nature does not ever use hexagrams to charge distribute or create life. For creating life, nature always uses a pentagram, which creates, as you see in the bottom right picture here, this 10 spirals of the golden mean ratio, because when you put a pent inside a pent, the ratio is golden mean ratio, 0.618. And that ratio creates a cascade where any two numbers, 0.618, 1.618, 2.618, that infinite cascade you can add and multiply, and it keeps going forever. But in addition to adding and multiplying, in addition to adding and subtracting, if you multiply any number in that progression by 1.618, you will get the next number here. We have the picture here. So in this progression, 0.618, 1, 1.618, 2.618, in that progression, any number multiplied by 1.618 equals the following number. So not only is it an arithmetic progression, it is also a geometric cascade. In other words, it allows both adding and multiplying. And you see, this is the difference between numerology and physics, because this is physics. We know numerology becomes physics when we predict what a wave is going to do. In this case, when waves cross recursively again and again, it's called recursive heterodyning, recursive constructive wave interference, they both add and multiply wavelength and wave velocity. And the only geometry that allows waves to add and multiply recursively, constructive heterodyning, is the golden mean ratio. Now, why am I talking about wave mechanics here? Well, actually, in science, there is nothing else to talk about than wave mechanics, actually. And you can graduate from numerology to physics if every time you talk about numbers, you say, did that predict what a wave is going to do? Then you don't get lost in the woo-woo land of numerology. Instead, you're talking wave mechanics. And this particular wave mechanics of golden mean ratio is quintessential. It's primary because only in this geometry, which allows waves to add and multiply both constructively, do you get non-destructive compression. Ooh, I'm going to say that again. Only in this geometry can you produce non-destructive charge compression. Now, efficient compression is the only solution to virtually every problem that physics has ever had. How to design a city, how to design a computer, how to make gravity, how to make energy, how to survive death, how to make alchemy, how to make fusion, how to. Every single big problem that physics has ever had, like Einstein said, the solution to the unified field is non-destructive compression. In other words, perfect compression is the most important problem you will ever think about. And it is specifically, and we're going to show you the slides to prove that it is specifically the only way to survive death. If you really understood constructive compression, you can plan and execute very well, very efficiently, very electrically, a plan to take memory through death after you understand perfect compression. Einstein was clear, perfect compression is the solution to the unified field because infinite non-destructive compression of charge is gravity, but no one told him what a fractal was. Now, mathematicians know the only perfect compression is fractal. Mathematically, that's proven. But electricians before me never once asked the question, what is a fractal electric field? Oh, well, you're going to see later I wrote an equation to prove that the structure of hydrogen is fractal, and that's how hydrogen makes gravity. So implosive infinite compression, Einstein was clear, is the cause of gravity, but he didn't know what implosive infinite compression is. Actually, the word answers the question. It's infinite. Nit by phi, golden ratio, infinite compression is the solution to gravity, and we'll explain more. Basically, the charge implodes from transverse electromagnetic to longitudinal. We'll explain later. And that longitudinal wave is squirted out the center of the pine cone at the Planck threshold, and that's what a gravity wave is. So if you know implosive charge compression, fractal infinite charge compression, real sacred geometry, then you, unlike Einstein, Stephen Hawking, and NASA, you could know why an object falls to the ground. Wouldn't that be fun? Then you can make gravity. I mean, you can have all kinds of fun. So this is the basics of why we're studying geometry, to learn about the pure principles of life itself. Incidentally, every living protein, DNA, Earth grid, zodiac, and the galaxy are exactly this golden ratio geometry called the stellation of dodecaecosa, which is the only possible three-dimensional fractal. And we call this the star mother kit because it is the mother of stars. And I wrote the equation to prove that's the geometry of how hydrogen is assembled. You can get your star mother kit if you want, goldenmean.info/kit. And just to give you a practical example, so then I took that new equation I wrote for those spirals of the golden mean, and I did CAD/CAM manufacturing and built a perfect vortex. Now that perfect vortex, we call it Schauberger's dream, and it became theimploder.com. And that creates a water implosive vortex, because if the water is a little bit hard water, it's called what's called piezoelectric. It means that it converts pressure waves into voltage if there's a bit of mineral in the water. And that means that vortex of simple water will make a spark. The same way Schauberger made charge from a vortex. And the same way you can make gravity with a vortex, if you understand Vimana Hanabu. So this perfected vortex we call Schauberger's dream became theimploder.com. And now that is what's called the ultra imploder, fractalfield.com/ultra imploder. And it's a commercial way to add a tremendous amount of vortex spin and centripetal magnetics, which creates radically reduced molecular cluster size in the water, which creates radically increased solubility, bioavailability, and growth. Basically, it's wetter water and more bioavailable, it's spin dense. And therefore, there's a tremendous effect on plant life, of course. It's beautiful for gardening. It's particularly effective if you have hard water. And people love it because they can feel the life force, the spin density, the charge in the water. So it radically improves the taste of the water. But that's just a practical example of applying sacred geometry to life force, in this case, to water and to make living water. Okay, so that was a basic introduction to sacred geometry. Now, I want to talk about sacred space a little bit more, and then I want to show you the slides about the Theraphi. Now, here's the Theraphi information. Maybe we'll talk about this as the next practical application. So what I did is let me show you here. I took these frequencies here. So I wrote a new equation called Origin of Negentropy, and this is my book. You can find it at fractalfield.com. The book is entitled Origin of Biologic Negentropy. It's available on Amazon and Kindle, or it's available in print, or it's available online, fractalfield.com. And the centerpiece of that book is my new equation named Origin of Biologic Negentropy. And the physics is ultra simple and ultra clear and ultra powerful. I should show you that picture. So we're going to return here at 141. But I took a dimension named Planck. Let's see, I need to find that slide, I suppose. Better to show you. I took the Planck dimension. Now, what is Planck? Planck is the wavelength in which every wave that physics has ever measured in both length and time. Yeah, here it is. So Planck length and Planck time are the musical key signature of the universe. All of physics is clear. There is a wavelength and a unit of wave time into which every wave that physics has ever measured divides evenly. And that's literally the musical key signature of the universe. You know, 1,000,000 light years in every direction, the Planck dimension is the same. In fact, it is the primary proof of the Big Bang, that distribution, that everybody agreed on Planck. That if you take that musical key of everything, Planck, and you multiply by golden ratio, and then keep doing that, multiply by golden ratio times golden ratio times golden ratio, it's called Planck length times golden ratio to the integer n power, then you get the only possible three-dimensional fractal, like the Star Mother kit here, and you get 3 exact radii of hydrogen. You get the wavelength of ADP, adenosine diphosphate, the most important molecule in the body. It mediates every energy transaction in the body, ADP. It's a musical key signature of cell metabolism, 1.91 angstroms. You get the only 2 colors that make photosynthesis happen, the purple and the orange, 427.691 nanometer, exactly. So you get the only 2 possible wavelengths that make photosynthesis happen. It's cool. Photosynthesis caused by this, and the name for this is called phase conjugate charge collapse, the origin of negentropy. It's called phase conjugate because when you conjugate or add and multiply recursively phases, phase conjugation, which is also perfected fractality, that's what golden ratio powers, multiples of golden ratio, are. So this is perfect 3-dimensional fractal charge collapse. And this equation, Planck times golden ratio, predicts also the British foot, all of sacred dimensions. Sacred dimensions in history are just a name for wavelengths that produce charge collapse. Planck times golden ratio. And we have a table, you get the Roman paste megalithic yard, they're all derived from charge embeddability. Charge embeddability, charge collapse is the only possible definition of sacred dimensioning in architecture. Because the only reason you want to use sacred dimension is to produce implosive charge collapse, because that makes life force and negentropy and makes your children's aura get big and makes plants grow. The same equation predicts the Schumann harmonics, the brainwave harmonics of bliss. It predicts the Mayer wave, the most important frequency in the blood, 0.1 hertz, which is also the LF of heart rate variability. It predicts the Venus year, Earth year, galactic year, and precessional year. In other words, every wavelength that nature uses to make life and negentropy is always golden ratio times Planck. That is a profound new insight. It also, by the way, is the cause of gravity. And here is the book on how those longitudinal, incorrectly called scalar waves, which come out the center of that pine cone at Planck, are gravity waves. And they predict gravitobiology, the title of Tom Bearden's book on this subject. But now that's a bit of the advanced material. We didn't want to go into the advanced physics here, but I want to point out that we've published now on this subject. You can find the published physics. Here are multiple publications in the science journals at fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity. So we actually published the Klein-Gordon and the Navier-Stokes equations to prove with generalized wave equations the physics that we have identified that golden ratio is the principle of perfected wave interference. Therefore, golden ratio is the principle of optimized constructive compression. There probably has never been a more important discovery in physics than to discover what is the solution to compression. And we can show you later you can go right from there to making energy from gravity. You can go right from there to making propulsion from rotation. You can go right from there to teaching the physics of actual alchemy. You can teach the physics of fusion energy and the bliss fusion in the blood. All of that becomes possible after you know what is the solution to constructive compression, which is golden ratio three-dimensional fractality. And we've published the equations to prove that. It's clear now in the literature. Fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity, and the parallel article, which is my lecture at the 0 Point Energy Conference in Amsterdam last year, actually a year and a half ago, fractalfield.com/vacuum energy. You can see all the papers, the PowerPoints, et cetera, et cetera. So we were talking about a practical example of how we apply this. Oh, I guess we have to play with our pictures here. The pictures are fun. So here is that wave shape. And you see those 10 spirals of the golden mean. They create a place where the pine cones kiss noses at center. And that's the implosion point where the transverse electromagnetic, the up and down, is converted to longitudinal or scalar, the compression wave. And it's the longitudinal wave, which is gravity waves, and ancestor memory, the collective unconscious, the communion of saints. It's actually, in physics, the correct term for that is longitudinal EMF, electromagnetic field interferometry. That is the physics of ancestor memory, and this is how they travel. And we have this other fun little picture. We like this picture. See, the non-destructive charge collapse, that pent dodeca there can change scale without changing ratio. That's called scale invariance. And that principle of scale invariance is the principle of perfected compression solved in three-dimensional by golden ratio. So scale invariance solution is the solution to the sacred, literally. And here we just did that lovely three-dimensional rotation of the dodecacosa. And here you see that sine wave. If you embed by golden ratio, you create the dodecacosa. And notice that the two sine waves actually seen from the side becomes the perfect Valentine, the caduceus, and Hermes. And the caduceus in physics today is called phase conjugation. So this is our work on how fractality causes gravity. But you didn't come here for the advanced physics. You came here for an introduction that could become practical. And that's why we're moving on in the conversation to examples of how we apply this to practical solutions, the science of spirituality, based on the physics of sacred geometry of everyday life. And I showed you how we did that for water at the implode.com. And I'm about to show you how we did that for plasma, where we're creating healing in many countries. Oh, just before we leave here, can't resist showing you our picture. So you see, when you take that golden ratio dodeca down the helix, and then you ratchet that helix and you rotate it, you create the embedding. And literally, that's the recursive braid inside braid that is a map to what happens in DNA at the moment of bliss. And here, where we measured that, this is, on the top is the onset of heart coherence. I invented the concept of heart coherence because I invented how it's measured, realheartcoherence.com. And when you measure, the heart becomes coherent like a laser, which is measurable when you feel love or speak your truth, for example. realheartcoherence.com, you can measure it. It's a lie detector and a love detector. It's a practical tool for measuring lies versus love. It does work. realheartcoherence.com. But here is the measurement made, thanks to Glenn Ryan at my suggestion, that in fact DNA recursively braid implodes when you feel love, when you feel heart coherence. And that embedding process, that implosion process, we call fusion in the blood. And here's a picture of how the short wave embeds on the longer wave in the recursive braiding of DNA, the Celtic knot, as it were. And that's what creates the fractality. It's called superlooping or embedding of the little wave surviving in the bigger wave in your DNA. And that implosion process goes to completion. Your DNA literally implode braids, and the plot thickens and your DNA thickens. And suddenly there's a longer wave embedding in your DNA. And that's actually a picture of the evolution of consciousness itself, because the presence of the longer wave embedded in the short wave is not just the definition of the sacred, but it's a definition of ensoulment and long-term memory. So that process of embeddability, that superlooping in DNA, we've been doing these lectures for so many years, we have too many pictures and too little time. But this is from the 7arrows.net. So if you do that recursive braiding in DNA and you braid the braid inside the braid 7 times, thread to string to rope to fat rope, the braid in the braid in the braid on the braid, in response to the phone-on coherent sound of love, coherence in your heart, bliss. The 7th time that the DNA actually turns inside out. It's the 7 arrows, the tetra actually, it's 7 arrows. And that's the opening of the 7th seal and the 7th sign. It's actually beautiful symbolism, but it's good physics. Okay, so before we get carried on, I wanted to give you the practical example of how we apply this to healing, actually, to negentropy, to creating life force. And so for that, I wanted to show you the story of Therify.net. And this is where we're talking about it here. So what I did, this is Therify, THERAPHI.net. Our plasma technology now has centers in 25 countries. It's used around the world. It's a plasma rejuvenation, pain reduction, and much, much more. And a lucid dream inducer by measurement is plasma healing. So this is an example of taking the science we just learned and creating an application which is literally bliss-inducing. Approximately 30% of people who experience this plasma, they sit between the plasma, approximately 30% report some sharpening of vision, and approximately 30% report some bliss or euphoria experience. And significant numbers, in addition to pain reduction and circulation, they report lucid dreaming triggered. Now, why would this trigger lucid dreaming? This is a fun introduction, because then once you understand that, you can understand how to take memories through death and how to build stargates and portals. So if you knew the electric field of lucid dreaming, ask Jodie Foster in the movie Contact. Was that an interstellar journey or was it a lucid dreaming? Well, I think it was both. So the physics of how you make a plasma field that is negentropic, which is to say self-organizing, and healing, and creates circulation, which is charge distribution efficient, and reduces pain. It's amazing. Localized pain we can deal with usually in 1 or 2 sessions, and long-term or chronic pain, we don't make medical claims, but in many cases, after say a week or 2 of sessions, we're able to help many people, even with long-term and chronic pain, and many other things. You can read it all, the blog at Therify.net. So how is this an example of what we just taught you about sacred geometry, physics? So basically, remember my equation here. These are if you take my equation, Planck times golden ratio, you get to these frequencies, 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8, 19, these frequencies right here, which happen to be the Schumann harmonics, almost exactly the Earth's heartbeat, which happen to be almost exactly the brainwave harmonics measurable during bliss, alpha, beta, theta, flameinmind.com, which happened to be the origin of negentropy. Well, one day I was studying this famous French healer and electrical technologist named Antoine Priori, P-R-I-O-R-E, Antoine Priori, who was famous here in France decades ago for healing tens of thousands of cancers. And oh, by the way, this plasma field would cause seeds to grow radically. And by the way, plasma Therify.net is being used by agriculture, especially biodynamics, all over the world just for charging seeds, because the effect on seed growth and plant growth is dramatic. So Priori had the same thing: seed growth, pain reduction, circulation, and healing, and negentropy, rejuvenation. He was famous, but he was spending tens of millions of dollars on each machine, and he did not understand the principle. He did not know what phase conjugation was. He did not even know you needed to use a pair of opposing tubes. However, the moment when I saw, thanks to my team, I saw that the frequencies Antoine Priori used, which he famously got from Wilhelm Reich, Lakowski, and Tesla. He got the frequencies from the grandfathers of frequency medicine. And these are the frequencies he used: 3, 10, 32 hertz, and 80 hertz. Now, if you look at these frequencies, you see they're very close to my equation. So as soon as we saw that Antoine Priori had gotten, by luck or by inheriting frequency recipes from Tesla and Reich, that they were close to the pure principle. But once we saw this, we knew what the pure principle was, which they did not, which is phase conjugate negentropy to Planck. So once we figured out the principle, perfected charge collapse, we took that frequency recipe and instead used my frequency recipe and did something else. And that was, we used a pair of opposing tubes exactly 180 degrees out of phase, because that's how you make phase conjugation. In optics, it's how you make lasers meet in a pine cone kissing noses, opposing lasers. And if they meet in a charge permissive media called a phase conjugate mirror, in phase conjugate laser optics, you create negentropy and time reversal. It's measured, it's proven, it's well known. But we made that more broad spectral, and we made the negentropy, the self-organization, more broad spectral, because we then took the low frequencies, this infrasound, modulated the optics by taking a noble gas. In this case, this is a noble gas mixture in here. It's a confidential noble gas mixture, but the noble gases are famous that when you ignite the noble gas, in this case with 500,000 volts in a complex wave, which begins in the megahertz range, 500,000 volts, and the opposing broad spectral pine cones, all the way from megahertz down to infrasound, that low frequency cascade I just showed you. And then we feed that complex wave out of this amplifier here, therify.net, and we dump it into a bifiller Tesla coil to convert that into a 500,000 volt complex wave. And because it's bifiller, we output that wave into two signals exactly 180 degrees out of phase, perfect mirror image. So where the two pine cones, big pine cones, kiss noses, not just RF, but optical, RF, and infrasound, a huge pine cone, precisely 180 degrees out of phase, all perfectly tuned to Planck. So we got very big pine cones kissing nose, imploding. And so that little point at the center where the two waves fields meet, you have that sweet spot. And there, for example, if you just hurt your finger and you put your finger there, the pain will go away. It's just like, now why does pain go away? Well, it's actually an interesting, it's been measured. Let's see if I can show you. So here is Elizabeth Rauscher, one of the world's most famous physicists and an old friend who died recently, unfortunately. She did an FDA study, and she took these frequencies here, strong magnetic fields, exactly the frequencies that come out of the coil in therapy.net, and she proved in FDA trials they were dramatically pain reducing. Why? The electrical information is because pain reduction is restored compression. Pain is defined electrically as fractality that's bleeding charge, because the fractal is broken and compression is broken. So the charge compression is broken, so the charge is bleeding out. So if you restore electrical compression, that is by definition the opposite of pain. You know, if you've got a pain, the first thing you instinctively do is you compress. Well, it turns out that you can apply that compression, and that restores centripetal force, which is the opposite of pain. So we took these frequencies, we modulated the RF and the optics with this frequency cascade. We produced therify.net. And we can do, as Priggery did, we can prove the effect on seed germination and growth and pain reduction. We create self-organization, and we create some bliss, and high percentage of the people get a sharpening of vision. They get out of the field effect and they say, I can see more sharply. It's similar to bliss because it's compression restored. This is the comparison of those frequencies. I don't know if you can see this, probably you can't, but in the bottom, the green harmonics here, 3, 7.83, 14, and 20 hertz. These are the actual frequencies of the Schumann harmonic cascade of the Earth. On top here in blue, these are the frequencies predicted by my equation. 2.78, 4.5, 7.29, 11.8, 19.09. So notice how the Schumann harmonics are very close to perfect implosive charge collapse, the origin of negentropy. So now we can answer the question which Lovelock proposed when he proved the Schumann harmonics with Gaia is self-organizing. It's negentropic. That's the concept of the Gaia hypothesis, which is that Earth itself regulated temperature and pressure and all to make life. Well, how did Gaia become self-organizing? It's proven. That's called the Gaia Hypothesis. It's because the Schumann harmonics are implosive and negentropic. And that's why that also identifies the brainwave harmonics. Okay, so you can read more about that story at therify.net. And here we just talk more about the frequencies of Therify here, which is my equation. These are frequencies of my equation. And this is the medical literature on healing cancer. The most famous frequencies in all of the cancer healing literature is 50 hertz and then 20 hertz. You see how the cancer literature is full of studies showing that these frequencies from my equation are the most famous cancer healing frequencies in all of the medical research literature. Why? Because they're implosive and negentropic and self-organizing. Okay, so we're running toward the end of this conversation, and we're just going to take about another 7 minutes, maybe 5, and we're going to talk about the physics of the electrical design for successful death. And that slide sequence begins at 221. Here we are. So the fractal conjugate electric field, which causes vision, we just talked about sharpening of vision, is also that allows that a little electric black hole, which allows memory to pass through death. So first, Ray Moody, who is a wonderful friend, wrote a lot of books on lightafterlife.com, and he's shown that the visions seen during death are electrically contagious. That means that the surgeons all have agreed that during a successful death, during a clear death, that the visions seen by the one dying will be seen by all of the doctors in the room at the same time. Why are the electric visions seen during successful death contagious? I think you should ask yourself that. So it turns out that the compression points that we talked about that make sacred space, the Druid song lines, etc., these cross points are also useful for successful death, because this is where the longitudinal compressional wave node, dodeca-ecosa Earth grid, creates sacred space. That's called longitudinal embeddability in science. And by the way, their nuclear radioactivity, critical mass is reduced, and telepathy is more possible. And at the magnetic cross point sacred space, labyrinths, cathedrals, stone circles, and telepathy and successful death are more possible. So here, for example, when you look at this picture of this person who just died, the reason you can see their aura leaving their body when they died is because this place, you see it's a forest here, the plasma distribution is permissive. If this was in an aluminum steel box of electrosmog called a hospital, you would not see this. That is important to know. So the distribution of charge called sacred space is essential to the physics of death. Now here we're talking about the fact that the process of mummification used a natron salt to alchemize the human flesh. That's why mummy powder was served in every pharmacy in Europe 300 years because of the gold powder well. It was because of the alchemy, the implosive charge collapse of what's called high dielectric constant of the natron salt, which is the physics of alchemy. And notice the Tibetans have long known that the perfect shrinking process, it's called green lion, red lion, is actually the key to successful death, because you implode the charge. And here we talk about the green lion, red lion had to do with the nanocolloids in the sacred one with the tanks, which is the transliteration of the Ark of the Covenant, which was a alchemic gold-making device because of implosive capacitance, and we don't have the time for that whole conversation. But basically, you rotate a conjugator, you make implosion, and that's a hint to what we're doing with carbon nano, which will be the most interesting technology on the planet, because you rotate a conjugator of sufficient purity, you make propulsion and energy directly, and it makes every other form of propulsion and energy on this planet look like the Stone Age as the kids need to grow up. But here's the climax of our lecture as promised. The physics of successful death is literally an implosive black hole fractal. Here is the measurement of where the soul goes after death in Light After Life by Korotkov. Here is the measurement of the number of hours it takes for the soul to leave the body after death in Y, 13 10 and 36 hours. And here is a map of the geometry seen during death, called the Heinrich-Clouvet form constant lattice cobweb tunnel spiral. And the reason you see that during successful death is because your body knows you must braid, implode in that 4 sequence of superposed symmetry charge collapse operations, lattice cobweb tunnel spiral, which is really DNA imploding. And the reason you see that during death is because you know how your whole memory passes through your eyes at the moment of death, because you're doing compression. The reason you're doing compression is you got to take all that transverse up and down magnetics, convert it to longitudinal compressional waves, which is the media, the world within which your ancestor memory propagates. So to get into the collective unconscious, you have to do compression. That's also why things like Therify are so good for releasing ghosts, because to release a ghost, you need that implosive compression. So again, that's a lot to take in a short time here. The point of all this is simply to say that if you're seriously interested, you can understand the physics, and I do mean the physics, of immortality and memory through death and healing for yourself. When you feel that little black hole of compression, what we call bliss process, you can also study that at goldenmean.info/Kundalini. And the harmonics are known. This is a teachable process. And when we understand the science of spirit, we can dispense with disempowering, immature miracle worship and personality worship, which eliminates religion wars, and instead understand spirituality as a loving science that makes spirituality actually much deeper and more beautiful. Thank you very much. You can reach me, Dan Winter, info@fractalfield.com. Thank you.
Okay, so Dr. Winter, we have 3 questions for you. The first one says, how do you explain wave conjugation in your device?
Yes, well, phase conjugation or wave conjugation is the essential principle here. It is the solution to compression. If you visualize the famous caduceus-shaped wave from Hermes, a caduceus, also the symbol of medical doctors, you see it's a series of waves that appears to cascade toward a still point. And that cascade of waves turns out to have what's called a frequency signature, a harmonic or musical recipe. And when that ratio of waves is perfect, then the waves approach compression implosively. It means they conjugate. To conjugate means the adding and multiplying recursive heterodyning, which is simply wave interference, is perfectly constructive. And that form of wave implosion eventually becomes centripetal. And that's the magic moment. In my device, Therify.net, we use that frequency recipe, which turns out to be simple golden ratio multiples of Planck length, the musical key of the universe, and we multiply by golden ratio, and we get this musical recipe. And in the low frequencies, it's an infrasound, low frequency cascade series, like, for example, the Schumann harmonics or the brainwave harmonics of bliss. And we modulate those low frequencies in the perfect musical recipe onto the higher frequency, a radio wave that drives the plasma. And then the plasma itself is called an optical phase conjugator because it's a noble gas. So it's called very broad spectral phase conjugation, which means it is more negentropic, more implosive, more self-organizing, and more healing.
Thank you. So the second question says, what is the relation of the golden ratio with the wave conjugation?
Yeah, that is clearly the heart of the matter. That's the fun, pure principle here. It turns out that golden ratio is known to define beauty for a reason in physics. And that reason is because if you add and multiply recursively, which turns out to be what wave interference has to do in order to compress perfectly. So 0.618, 1.618, that infinite or infinite series turns out to be a solution to wave interference. So wave interference perfected is called conjugation, as in, for example, when you have conjugal relations in sexuality, it does mean you recursively add and multiply and interfere the genes. So when you conjugate waves, they add and multiply recursively, constructively, that picture of the caduceus. And the problem of perfect conjugation, perfect adding, multiplying, is solved only by the golden mean ratio, because with golden mean, you can add each number, 0.618, 1.6, you can add each number to get the next number infinitely, or you can multiply. 1.618 squared is 2.618, etc. So because that's the only progression which both adds and multiplies, it is therefore the solution to conjugation and compression. Compression is the solution to almost every problem physics has ever known: alchemy, urban design, computers, going through death.
Thank you. And the third and the last question says, can you give us some examples of wave conjugation in natural phenomena?
Well, the classic example in physics of phase conjugation, when it was first discovered, when they discovered if you make lasers smash into each other precisely from opposing directions, exactly phase locked, and in a very permissive, called phase conjugate mirror, then phase conjugate optics first measured negentropy, self-organization, and time reversal. That was the discovery in physics in phase conjugate optics, the perfect mirror. Now, in order to make that fascinating, I'd like to suggest to you that when the Olmec used a black obsidian mirror to telephone their ancestors using scrying by the shaman, that is another example of phase conjugation, that black mirror, because you see the longitudinal, the compression wave interferometry, the longitudinal grid, like sacred space, is the array in which those compressional waves, sometimes called scalar, nest, literally the collective unconscious. So phase conjugation is the answer to ancestor phone calls. Isn't that fascinating? And it also, we have now new proof. If you take the only two very narrow frequency of color, which causes photosynthesis, it's one in blue and one in purple, actually one in the orange and purple, but the only two very narrow color bands cause photosynthesis, nothing else. And if you take those frequencies and you see they're exactly golden ratio exponents of Planck, meaning phase conjugation is the reason photosynthesis exists and is negentropic. How's that for an example?
Thank you very much, Dr. Winter. It's a pleasure to have you here. It's an honor to have you here with us. So I thank you very much for your participation and for answering the questions.
I'm happy to be with you there in Brazil, and we send lots of love from over here. Blessing, blessing. You can see me at fractalfield.com anytime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.